So earlier this week, we interviewed the priest and theologian Ian Markham, and he'd been on a remarkable spiritual journey from the Exclusive Brethren in Devon to the Episcopal Church in Virginia in the United States. And it's also therefore a great pleasure to be interviewing Simon Pellew. Simon, can you remind me how to pronounce your last name correctly? Pellew.
Pellew is fine.
Pellew.
I actually have trouble with it myself, so don't worry.
Great. OBE. And Simon, you've made a considerable social journey yourself. You have been named on the online website, thepeerage.com. But you've run an equal pay policy in a charity operating one of the toughest council estates in South London. So I'm going to come back to your work in PECAN later, Simon, but welcome. Wonderful.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Joseph.
But first, as this is a sort of oral history, could you tell us when and where you were born?
I was actually born in Westminster Hospital in London, 1959.
1959.
I know, it feels a long time ago. So.
Great. Now, can you tell us a bit about the illustrious Pellew family background? Let's start there.
I think it's I would think that's a bit of an exaggeration. In the distant past, I've got a moderately well-known Napoleonic admiral as an ancestor. He's really well-known because he fictionally was Hornblower's captain. So, and he fought a couple of good battles. He got made a lord, fairly typically of that period. He made a lot of money in prize money, and then lost it all digging silver mines.
Okay.
So, and my side of the family descended from the youngest son. So,
yeah. So a bit of history there. Now, Simon, we found in doing these interviews, starting with your family, that starting with grandparents and then working forward is really helpful and unpacks quite a few things. So if we could start with your grandparents, could you tell us what you remember about them? Anything that comes to mind, who they were?
I only actually knew one of my grandparents, my mother's mother. My father, both my grandfathers died when I was about 1960. And my father never talked much about his father. He obviously adored his mother, and I just very, very vaguely remember her. She died about 65. The thing I remember most about her was her dying and how upset my dad was. My mother's mother lived with us for a short while, and I knew her quite well. A very sort of upright, controlled lady, I would say. Though I could still remember her giving me a bath and drying me. So I've obviously got some quite fond memories.
Lovely. If we move on to your parents, often parents can be quite different temperamentally to each other. Was that the case with your parents?
Very much. My parents had a 13-year age difference. So my dad had fought in the war. After the war, neither of my parents went to university. My dad was one of 5, and his youngest brother and sister were both really intelligent, and both one went to Oxford, one went to Cambridge. And I think Dad was viewed slightly as the thick one in the family. So he was sent to work as a bank clerk in Barings Bank. And he joined up on the first day of the war, which I think to escape the bank. And my mother had severe rheumatoid arthritis from when she was a child, and had quite a bad time during the war. And then she sort of recovered from that and became an actress. So, and she was, I think she sort of said as she said by herself, during the sort of late 40s and 50s, she was quite wild. I think having a very nice time as an actress in London, and then she became a journalist. And my dad went to Brazil after the war. He didn't think there was any future in England. Worked in Brazil for about 6-7 years, then eventually came back to England. And in 57, my parents met, and they got engaged after about 6 weeks, and Dad sort of certainly said he knew what he was looking for.
Oh, so they met in 1957, whirlwind romance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Got married. I came along 18 months later.
Gosh, wow. And what was your father doing when you got married?
He was a salesman. Dad would always been a sort of quite good at selling, good with people. Very yes, he'd be very good, quite life and soul to the party. Not sort of quite a serious man in some ways, but great, quite fun with people. I mean, my mother also was great fun. But my dad I think he was good at selling. Possibly not a very good judge of character, but we'll come on to that a bit later on. And he was selling plastics. He was also always quite entrepreneurial. He wanted to set up businesses, and he set up a business that did quite well. Then he sold it, and eventually set up a chain of launderettes in the early 60s. And that will definitely come into the story a bit later on. So, and Dad then worked running these launderettes for about 35 years. And those were all over South London.
Yeah, gosh, fantastic. Thank you. So, can you give us a feel for your hometown, the local area?
I grew up in, I grew up in a village, really. If you go there now, it's just south of Epsom, and it's now incredibly suburban. But when I was growing up, it was quite rural, and it was quite a lovely upbringing in many ways. A friend of mine called it in the blighted world, and it was a bit like that. So there was hundreds of children. We all had big houses. Most of my neighbours had tennis courts or swimming pools. And we just wandered. We wandered between each other's houses. My memory is that my parents didn't, let me out beginning of the beginning of the day, and I'd come back about 6 o'clock in the evening, and they wouldn't really know where I was before then. I mean, it probably wasn't quite like that, but that's my memory of it.
The world has changed.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah. So lovely. And were your family religious at all? Religiously observant?
Not at all.
No?
Other than so we didn't go to church. But the two things that always struck me, and they influenced me quite strongly. One was my dad prayed. Certainly at that stage, he prayed. I remember him sort of kneeling by his bed and praying. And the other thing was, probably when I was a little bit older, he'd always read the Bible to me every week. So on a Sunday after lunch, I'd sit with him and read the Bible. He didn't, and I was the oldest. He didn't do this with my two younger sisters. I'm not quite sure why, but then my parents also would do a lot of homework with me. They made me have to work quite hard. So we'd read the Bible, and then we'd have maths homework to do. So, but I could just remember him always reading the Bible. And I suppose I grew up. I was also sent to Sunday school. Again, it was sort of very much what happened in the village. Children went to Sunday school on Sunday morning. And I can remember I sort of took this quite seriously. So I sort of believed, even though my parents, I don't think it particularly ever encouraged me.
It's funny, I have a memory of being a young child talking to a friend about one of his friends going to Sunday school. And I remember, what is this Sunday school thing? And they go, oh, it's our friend, he goes to this church, and there's a thing for the kids in the Sunday morning. And I said, well, do his parents go to the church? Oh, no, his parents don't go to the church. I must have been about 8 years old thinking, what weird thing would parents send their children to church but not go themselves? That's one of my, I had no idea what church was, but the Sunday school system.
I mean, for us, it was almost the exact opposite. So I can remember walking up with my sisters. So we'd all just trundle up the footpaths, get to the church hall, So we didn't go into the church. It was in a separate hall.
Yeah, in a separate hall. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Seemed very natural.
So, and did you have any other, outside of that, the family or you, any other contacts with Christians or church life anywhere?
No, not at all. I mean, church was really, we'd go to church. We were Christmas and Easter, so we would go at Easter. I can't remember church having any significance at all in my life. So my parents used to say I actually got into a fight with a boy because he said he didn't believe in God. So I thought I'd need to show my voice.
You got those basics right.
Yes.
Now, do you have any memories from the Sunday school, things that you did or you were learning, or anything that's
no, nothing at all. So I did once or twice when I was older, sort of 10, 11, go to church, I think by myself. But I can't think why I did that. So, yeah.
Oh, great. Now, I understand that you went to Charterhouse School in Surrey. Was that a boarding school?
Yeah, I detested it.
I don't even need to ask. What was that experience like? What did you detest about it?
I was very badly bullied, and so that I mean, it was a very bad experience for me. But it's also, I mean, I just think it's so bad sending children away from their parents. So damaging. Now, I take a pretty extreme view on this, but my experience was hideous.
Okay. And you had to endure this for the whole. There was no reprieve. No.
It was 1 year. It was the first year was really bad. After that, I learned how to cope with it a bit more, and I made some friends. But I mean, I still think the concept of sending children away from their parents is very strange. And I mean, my parents did it because that's what people did. It was just sort of fairly unthinking it. And I mean, I think that's affected me. But also, I became a Christian at school, and that was positive. And it was a good education. So I mean, good things came out of it. But I hated every minute. Well, I hated most of it.
Yeah. So I mean, a couple of good things that you said you became a Christian. How did that take place?
I think really, in my first year, I got to know a couple of Christians. They were reasonably, they basically weren't bullying me. And so I hung out with them and started going to Sunday school. Not Sunday school, Christian Union with them. And I mean, Charterhouse, you had chapel every day, but chapel was nobody, that was just going on in the background. But Christian Union made a difference. And this was early in the sort of start of charismatic renewal. And I very rapidly got involved in that. And that was very exciting. And the first summer, so I became a Christian in 72. And you might even remember this, Jason, something called Spree 73. Billy Graham came. And I can't understand how this happened, but I somehow managed to persuade my parents to let me spend a week by myself in London doing evangelism with Spree 73. So I was 14 years old.
You were 14, yeah.
And I stayed in a church hall in Putney.
Right.
And the people who were there I thought were Germans until the last day when I discovered they were Glaswegian. But I hadn't understood a word the whole week. And
that's great.
I sort of met a couple of other guys from school occasionally, but basically I was completely alone for a whole week when I was 14. I can't imagine how my parents ever let me do that. But anyway.
They must have had no idea what you were going to be doing.
Yeah, well, I guess so. Yeah. And I vividly remember I'd only brought sandals, hadn't brought shoes. So by the end of it, I was so filthy. And
did you enjoy it, the whole experience?
I look back on it with sort of, I don't know. I think it's sort of, I can remember I was taking the 4 spiritual laws into Hyde Park and approaching people and saying, do you want to become a Christian? And again, these people must have been bemused at this little boy coming up to them.
Yeah. My first Billy Graham, I didn't become a Christian until I was 1986, and it was one of the last Billy Graham campaigns, the Meaning of Life one. Do you know the Meaning of Life? And at Luton Town Football Club, and I remember going, and I really don't remember what Billy Graham said, and I do remember lots of people went forward and they were never seen again. I just caught I was too young to appreciate who Billy Graham was. Back then.
I'm sure. Yes, I mean, I also just find it odd looking back, as I don't remember much of it. That's how. I think I was extremely fervent, and I think that must have scared my parents as well. So,
I wonder how you persuaded them to let you do this.
Yes.
So, are there any individual teachers or mentors at that time of your life that stand out?
There were a couple of teachers 2 Christian teachers who I think were helpful, and there were some boys who were helpful as well. I don't think anybody hugely stands out. And I think I was sort of very serious. I was going along on Sunday evenings to David Pawson's church, Millmead. And I think up until I was about 17, then my final year at school, I began to sort of drift away quite a lot. Again, I'm not really sure quite what was going on in myself, but so I'd sort of spent this sort of mid 14, 15, 16 very fervent, and maybe I just stopped.
That was a very big church. It must have been a very big church at the time, wouldn't it? With David.
Oh, it's huge. Yes, yeah. I mean, David Pawson was. I could sort of remember him. I can't remember much what was taught, but I can remember him being sort of quite engrossing, quite gripping.
Yeah, I became a Christian in a Baptist church in Luton, Stopsley Baptist Church, and
yes.
Gork Roger was the pastor, and there's just these epic Baptist churches around the country, Torquay Baptist, Millmead, Stopsley, that had these. I guess I wouldn't call them celebrity, but just these larger than life senior ministers, weren't there? Renowned preaching ministries that ran them.
Yeah, I suspect my parents were also probably both worried about my fervency, which I know they did, because they actually talked it over with the school, and they were a bit unsure about me going to a non-Anglican church as well, probably. Got quite short.
Step closer to a cult.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Did they have conversations with you about your fervency and their concerns?
No, I tried to convert them.
Okay. How did that go?
Pretty badly. I mean, my dad just didn't get what this was all about. My mother sort of a bit of I think, slightly hankered after it. I think deep down, my mother really, she had this terrible rheumatoid arthritis, and she really, I think, probably deep down was quite angry with God over it. So I prayed for her once or twice. Anyway, so.
Yeah, you actually prayed with her.
Yes, yeah.
And she let you.
Sadly, she wasn't healed, but.
Yeah. Oh gosh. And so were your parents slightly happy when your fervency tapered off a bit?
Well, they probably didn't notice because I was in boarding school. So
that's true. I wonder if they thought it was a phase you were going to grow out of.
Well, they certainly talked about that. I mean, that's the language, yes.
Yeah, that's the language. There you go. So with your faith waning a little bit, and then your finishing school. What happened then for decisions for what you were going to do next?
Well, it's actually slightly odd. I'd always dreamt of joining the Navy. So I actually joined the Navy, but I also was increasingly also becoming interested in environmental movement. And I really thought I'd like to do geography or even environmental science. This was sort of in the early, mid-70s. And the school absolutely was not prepared to, well, in fact, my teachers refused to sign my ARCA form. And so my mother came and had a huge row with my housemaster. And in the end, they compromised on geology. So
what would the school have preferred that you studied?
Maths. So anyway, and it shows the sort of power. I just don't think you could have that nowadays. Anyway, so I went to, I did get into Cambridge, and so I got into Bristol to read geology, and I took a year off. I did the sort of hitchhiked around America, and I delivered furniture in Germany, and then I went to join the Navy for a few. I did a little bit of training before university, and then went to university being sponsored by the Navy.
So we just skated over a couple of things there. Let's go in backwards. You went to Germany. Now that was definitely Germany and not Glasgow at this point.
Actually, ironically, it was Munich. And going to Munich to learn German is a bit like going to Glasgow to learn English.
Right.
So,
what was the reason for that? Why were you trying?
I wanted to learn some German, and I got a job delivering furniture. And I discovered very rapidly that I didn't even know useful words like put down your end of the cupboard or this is too heavy. So anyway, I felt sorry for the people I was working with because I was so useless. And then anyway, I had a bit of money, and then I spent it hitchhiking around America with a friend.
Okay.
So that was fun.
So you made a bit of money enough to hitchhike around America, and that was a good time, was it, with a friend?
Oh yeah. And then and then I joined the Navy.
Navy. And what were you doing in the Navy?
Well, this was sort of, I suppose, this is probably perhaps a family background as well. I'd sort of always dreamt of going in the Navy. I mean, from when I was very, very young. So I was training. I was on an officer training program. It was being sponsored through university. So it's every holiday you spent then on back at training. So one holiday I applied to do a parachuting course, and they sent me on a typing course. So I actually typed very fast, but I still never been parachuting.
You apply for a parachuting course, but they put you on a typing course.
Yeah, well, it is the armed forces. So
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. You made me realise there's a photo I've got somewhere. My father joined the Navy when he was 18, and he's long since dead, but never talk about it. I don't think it lasted very long, and I don't think he was very good.
I would say that probably both those applied to me actually as well. But it's funny, a bit of me still looks back with certain almost affection. I mean, I'm still sort of, a bit of me is interested, even though as I became, well, again, maybe I jump ahead, but back at university, my faith sort of rekindled, and I began to increasingly also begin to get more involved in the environmental movement, and a bit more concerned about Christian involvement with violence. So I was becoming slightly more uncomfortable about being in the armed forces and wanting to focus much more on environmental issues. And so actually I resigned from the Navy after 2 years. So I can't say I had an illustrious career.
Can you still tie knots and things?
Just about, yes. But I mean, I spent 6 weeks on the old Ark Royal just before it was decommissioned. So I didn't really see very much modern kit, or even what was modern for the 80s. Anyway, it was a good experience. It was a reasonably good experience.
So the Ark Royal is a piece of history. Did you get to go to sea in the Ark Royal?
Oh yeah, and strangely, I was actually second officer on the watch. I mean, they put, I was the most junior person on the ship, but they still made us do what felt like quite serious things. So I ended up actually trying to navigate Ark Royal, and we had a very early sat nav, which actually put us in the middle of Glasgow. So even my navigation knew that was wrong. But
gosh, what a memory! And you managed to get your sea legs.
Yeah, well, you don't really need Ark Royal. You could go for days without actually seeing the sea. Yeah, it was such a big ship.
Wow, yeah, it must have been. So, so then, Simon, you go and do a master's.
Yes, well, this was the environmental side growing. So, I did geology, and I really wasn't a great geologist. I still can't really tell one rock from another, and all that time back from school, I've been sort of increasingly more and more interested, particularly in environmental movement and around energy policy. And I saw this master's at Imperial on energy economics, and it absolutely was what I wanted to do. So I resigned from the Navy and went and did the master's, and it was absolutely fantastic. It was a brilliant year, and at the same time, my faith had sort of rekindled. And when I started, and my first week in London, well, actually my second week in London, I found this church called St. Simon's, and that was brilliant in many ways as well. So that first year back in London was really good.
Now, doing a master's, did you think about an academic career? Was that ever? Did you want to?
No, I don't think I'm sort of good enough for that. Also, I was very fortunate. I got put on a sort of internship with a research group called IIED, who are still around, and I was involved. I was a research assistant, but it wasn't a very academic research group. They were very practical. I was involved in public inquiry, the hearing over Sizewell, the nuclear power station. Which, it's funny, just a couple of weeks ago, I was hearing about the thing, they're just about going to decommission it. So my whole life has been seeing Sizewell designed, built, run, and now decommissioned. And at the time, we said it was going to be a complete waste of money. And I think we were proved right. So
now, according to the details I've got here about your life, Simon, that in your early 20s, you go to America.
Yes. So I did 2 years with this environmental group. Then I did 2 years with British Gas, partly because I wanted to see almost what the opposition was like. And it was pre-privatisation, and it was, quite frankly, it was everything you could imagine a sort of public sector, old school body was like. And then I was getting really fed up with it. My church ran into massive issues. Our vicar had an affair, and the church sort of imploded after it having been a really fantastic experience. So that was really painful. And so I really felt I wanted to sort of escape. And I was also becoming very interested in Anabaptist theology, both about war and peace, and also social justice. And so I went to an Mennonite seminary in Elkhart, Indiana for a year.
That's where it was. Okay. Yes, Elkhart, Indiana. So, how did you discover this Mennonite theological stream?
There's several things. One is there's a small Mennonite group in London, and it was led by a guy called Alan Kreider. And I'd heard Alan speak a few times and been very impressed by him. I started reading, I've been reading various books that came out of that tradition, like British Christians in Age of Hunger, and The Upside Down Kingdom by Donald Kraybill. And the Upside Down Kingdom had really gripped me as an idea. And I'd been in a sort of study group with some other people from my church, and we'd really been influenced by this book. And we were trying to really look to see our faith make an impact. So we were exploring ideas around community, crime and justice, violence, and as well as the environmental movement. So it was obvious going in, looking at seminary, looking at this tradition, which I was so gripped by.
So why not a seminary in Germany? How did you? Because maybe you
my German is not good enough.
You did go to a Mennonite seminary in Germany. You went back to the States. What was there a connection or a link there through friends or?
No, I mean I spoke to Alan Kreider, and he I think he probably got me in. No, I didn't know anybody. It just seemed seemed like a good idea.
Yeah. Well, let's as we've got you here, can you tell us a bit about Mennonite theology and its particular influences and practices?
Yeah. Well, I think I probably want to distinguish actually between Mennonite and Anabaptists, and this might be a little upsetting to the Mennonites, but when I was first at seminary, they got us to do one of these things, the whole year group, to stand on the line on where we considered ourselves on the radical Anabaptist to Presbyterian spectrum. And the only people who were at the Anabaptist end was me and another foreigner. All the Mennonites, who were historical Mennonites, were all wanting to be much more sort of conventional. And I mean, I was very gripped by the whole idea about the sort of skepticism about the church relationship with the state, how we need to be careful. I mean, what role does the church really have in being involved with the state? I was very interested in the community. I was very interested in the role of prophecy as well in early Anabaptist teachings. I actually did a sort of study on that. And I think particularly the Swiss brethren were quite prophetic in a sort of fairly modern understanding of that. So to my mind, they sort of combined political activism with a real sort of spiritual awareness, which I guess is where I wanted to be. I wanted to be making a social impact, but I didn't want any of the sort of compromise over evangelism, over looking for spiritual involvement.
So that was a good time for you, stimulating time.
Yeah, mostly, and I made some very good friends there, and so I really enjoyed that time there.
Oh, brilliant!
And then I worked for 3 months in Chicago with a church called Icthus Fellowship, working mainly with Cambodian refugees. So that was also quite fun.
Yeah, I can see this increasing progression. So you went from the Mennonite seminary to Chicago, working. Working. Was that, how did you fund all of that, just out of interest, this whole period?
Well, I got a scholarship to go to the seminary, gave me a scholarship, which was wonderful of them.
Yeah.
And my dad had given us some money when we were younger. Presumably he wanted it for a house deposit or something, and I used all that.
Their fears came true.
Yes. And the only other thing, which is also probably quite important, was I also started going to, I went to several Vineyard conferences as well. Again, this is fairly early on in Vineyard. And when I was there, I actually went to this conference on how to be a Christian manager. I can't remember it very well, but Terry Virgo was speaking, and he talked about this church in South London called Icthus, and it was sort of the first time I'd heard of Icthus, and I don't know why, but I clocked it as being of interest. So, which is also sort of slightly ironic that I heard about Icthus from Terry Virgo in America.
In America, so you heard from a New Frontiers pastor in America about Icthus in London. The Christian world is a small world, isn't it? At times?
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Donald Kraybill? Very important. to you, wasn't
he? Well, yes. I mean, the exciting thing was he actually taught me. He did a course in sociology. Came and did a sort of 1 month course in sociology at the seminary, and I got to know him quite well. And then I stayed with him for a couple of days at his home in Pennsylvania. And he actually sort of showed me around all the Amish country. So that was great fun. I think he'd sort of probably slightly moved on from the upside down kingdom. So he wasn't particularly talking about that. He was very much talking about sociology and how that would influence faith, which I actually also found incredibly valuable, because I suppose that introduced me to the whole issues around power and how power operates and should operate. I'm also amazed. I think I've been so strongly influenced by Donald Kraybill, and a little while ago I was reading. I actually just opened up the Upside Down Kingdom and glanced at it, and suddenly discovered a whole bunch of ideas which I thought were my ideas are all there, and I'd actually got them all from him. So, so I think he sort of, yeah. I mean, he's a nice man. I haven't really stayed in touch. I've written to him once or twice since then. But I did sort of tell him I tried to put into practice a lot of what he taught, which must be quite nice for a teacher, I guess.
Yeah, hopefully. It's you're just sorry. A personal anecdote for me. I became a Christian. Went to Spring Harvest. Do you remember Spring Harvest?
Yes, of course.
And Jim Graham was speaking. I must have been 16, 17 years old, and he had a book on prayer. And he actually walked, when I was a new Christian, he prayed for me at Spring Harvest with his, and he said he normally didn't do that. And it was such a moving experience. And I suddenly thought, I've never written to this man to say what happened to me after he prayed for me when I was 16, 17. And I sent him a letter, and he got the letter about a week before he died. So I never heard from him personally, but his son made contact with me. And he said his dad had said, you never guess he said it made his day to get a letter from someone who'd been 16 saying, thank you for that time that you prayed for me. So yeah, Donald, he's been very influential on many people, Donald, hasn't he? And a mentor to many. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Now, I mean, this is becoming a rich life here at this point, isn't it? With all of this, just sounds so wonderful, Simon. I'm just wondering what your extended family are making of you at this point. You're obviously not growing out of this. It's not a phase. It's intensifying. What Christmas and Easter? What was Christmas like with your family?
I think my parents were sort of by this stage they were still quite anxious. I mean, I think we're going off to America for a year. But they're quite supportive. I'd got baptized in my Anglican church. It actually did practice adult baptism, rebaptism. And my parents, they didn't come to the baptism service. I did invite them, but they sent me a present, which seemed like a reasonable compromise. My sisters, one of them had sort of come along to Louis Pellew. But neither of them were very interested, I don't think, in faith. So I think it was always a slightly tricky subject for my parents. I think, as time went on, they became sort of happier about it. Probably because I've become less irritating as well for them. But
wonderful. So you're back in England in the early 1980s. Did you go to Icthus? Is that where you ended up at?
Yes. Well, I came back to England really unsure what to do. Do I go back into energy economics or do I do something else? And I contacted Icthus and said, would you be able to use me, preferably paid? And I had an interview with Roger Pawson and Roger Mitchell and their administrator called Mike Oates. And there was a slight, my memory of it is a slightly strange interview because Roger Forster wanted me to work with him on Anabaptist church history. He was fascinated by, I'd done all this study on Anabaptist church history. I'd sort of rather specialised in that in seminary, and I'd studied particularly exegetical techniques around things like spiritual gifts. Roger Mitchell quite wanted me because he wanted to push the social action stuff, and that was what I wanted to do. And the administrator wanted me because I could write databases. In the end, actually, Roger Forster lost out, and I sort of worked for the other two.
Well, nice to be so wanted.
I was quite pleased. Yes,
3 pillars of the church.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of money involved, but yeah, it was okay. So I came down to South East London. I must admit I'd never even heard of Forest Hill and Sydenham and Catford. So this was completely new territory. I didn't know anybody down here. So that was a bit uncomfortable for a while, but
yeah. So what was it like there? I mean, I know it's changed considerably, but what was it like in the 1980s, South East London?
Well, I'd been living in West London, Shepherd's Bush, and Shepherd's Bush at that time was much less salubrious than it is now. It's gone massively upmarket. So actually, I didn't find, in fact, South East London to some extent seemed a lot greener, more open, bigger parks. Can I back up, Jason? Just one story which I missed out on, which was a very significant one to me. Which was, as I say, my parents lived just south of Epsom, and one time I was coming back by train from Epsom to Victoria, and going through the sort of, I imagine the Clapham, Battersea area. I was looking out the window, and I really felt a sort of, looking back, I feel it was from God, a sort of sense that I really, of people living in big tower blocks, and the feeling that living in these sort of trapped lives in these buildings, there was something really wrong about it. And it was I'd had this strong feeling that I needed to do something about it. And I sort of vaguely looked at doing things when I was in Shepherd's Bush, but nothing's happened. So when I came down to South East London, I was looking for an opportunity to sort of go somewhere along those lines. So for me, there were lots of housing estates in South East London. In a way, that's what I was expecting. There were, the housing estates everywhere in London. I can't say I particularly felt South East London was very different. I mean, from other parts of London, maybe lacking insight there, but
south of the Thames and north of the Thames.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
And then I remember being introduced to the big housing estates on North Peckham. I mean, and they were shocking. I mean, the estates, there's Gloucester Grove, North Peckham and Camden. I found them very disturbing, these massive, appalling, these were really horrible places.
Yeah. I came across South East London when I would have been about 19 onwards. I grew up in, we used to say, dragged up in Luton. So I think I lived on every single major council estate in Luton. Started in Hockwell Ring in a tower block that's now been pulled down. I don't remember because I was too young.
Yeah.
So it felt, so when I went to South East London, I think my impression of it as late teen, early 20s was the similarities to having grown up in Luton because of the council estates, but the difference, there were these sort of, I understand them, like there were Victorian villas that were safe from slum clearances mixed in here, and there were leafy green. It was, South East London was just this huge variegation.
You definitely get that, but again, I found Shepherd's Bush was a bit like that. You had the White City estates right next to some very lovely green areas.
Yeah, and Peckham was just so different to Greenwich. And
Oh yeah,
yeah,
yes.
I mean, and Peckham was. I used to going to Lewisham Hospital, and I in the early 1990s, and used to try to avoid Peckham if I could late at night. But now,
and Peckham was. I mean, Peckham certainly was quite a scary place. I mean, even now it can be, but at the time, I mean, it had such a bad reputation, and I think it was North Peckham, and I think it was fairly justified. I mean, the crime levels were appalling, and it was a really miserable place, I think, in lots of ways.
But I can imagine the multiracial, lively mixture that it must have been.
Yes. Yeah, I'm always embarrassed. I'm not sure I was hugely aware of it, one way or the other. I mean, at this time I met my wife, and my wife is Indian.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you how did you meet your?
She worked for Peckham. She worked for Icthus.
Oh, did she? Oh.
And we shared an office. So, and she'd grown up. She lived in Sydenham. So she was very much a local girl, and and I can't hugely. I mean, there were people from other ethnic groups around. I can't. I don't think it's sort of made huge impact on me one way or the other.
I mean, and so if we could talk a little bit about your wife. So you met her. Can you tell us her name?
Shunu.
Shunu, and what's Shunu's family's?
Okay, her parents. Her father was a Bengali Hindu, but not really religious at all. He was really a Marxist. He was imprisoned by the British in late 30s. In fact, ironically, my father would have been in Calcutta at the same time as him, but my dad was in the Indian Army, and Gopal was in prison. Then he was released. Then there was Indian independence. He was a Bengali. His family lost their property and had to flee as refugees to Calcutta. And then he met my mother-in-law, who was from South India, from the ancient Christian Orthodox community from Kerala, and she was working as a midwife she was working as a nurse in Bombay, and they met. And then Eliama, my mother-in-law, was coming to England to train as a midwife, and he came over about a year later, and they got married here in England, and sort of more or less stayed after that. So they're from quite different Indian communities.
And how did your wife to be Shuna? Is it Shuna? Shunu. How did she end up working in the same office as you? What was her?
She became a Christian through Icthus when she was about 14, 15. Mainly because Icthus, just fairly soon after it started, had some very good youth work. She got involved in that. And then she did Icthus's training. She did theology at Glasgow University, then came back and did Icthus's training course, and then was taken on by the church, and was actually leading a church at about the age of 22 or 23. And we shared an office. So, because I was working for Icthus and she was on the pastoral team.
Yeah. And inter-office relationships were not prohibited. Is that right?
No, they weren't.
Brilliant. So, how soon did you get married? You may have already told me. So
About a year and a half, I think it was.
Right.
She took a bit of persuading, actually. So,
yeah. Great. So, I mean, sorry if I'm trying to imagine these two families coming together and some of the connections. Did you make those connections very quickly? Oh, the dad was there and you were there.
No, actually, that connection really came back when my son had to write a history essay. Very much and he did this essay on what happened during the war, and suddenly sort of realised that how unlikely it was that we would have happened. When my father was the colonial army in some ways, fighting the Japanese, and Gopal was in prison, and the sort of what could have been, they were at that stage were enemies, and yet after the war, that was all reconciled. So,
and if what was it like for the Pellew family to meet and become in relationship with the Chowdhury family?
Yes, and vice versa, of course.
Yeah, what was that like for you?
Mostly, well, my immediate family can see that actually Shunu's a fantastic person, and I think they were very relieved that I found someone who clearly would be very good for me. I had one or two uncles who made slightly snarky comments, but Shunu's side of the family were quite capable of holding their own. So I had one uncle who was sitting next to one of Shunu's aunts at the wedding, and he said, well, Shunu's a very lucky girl to be marrying Simon. And this aunt certainly said, well, actually, I would think it's rather the opposite. And they were more than capable of holding their own. So I don't think there was much issue about sort of race. I mean, I had one uncle who did make a comment, but and I don't think any of Shunu's family, I don't think any of them had problems. But yeah, you might occasionally have a relative making some comments, but it's in the end none of their business.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me ask you about that. That's something. If we move on to the Peckham Evangelical Churches Action Network that you set up, PECAN, how did that come into life and being?
Well, I suppose I'd been taken on by Icthus to sort of set up their social action, or at least that's how I interpret it. I started off. We were talking. I read a book talking about how work was coming to an end. There was going to be mass unemployment. This was at the start of the sort of this was sort of Thatcher.
There was lots of unemployment through the mid.
Yes, and there was this movement saying, work, we're never going to have full employment, so the church needs to be helping people adjust to being unemployed. And I thought this was a load of garbage. Partly as an economist, I just didn't believe it, but it just seemed to me it was pathetically pessimistic, and people needed to work, and I just didn't believe it. So I thought what would be much more interesting would be to help people find work. And I started off by trying to set up. Peckham had quite a lot of furniture restoration. It had a bit of a tradition of furniture restoration. And I thought maybe we could set up a training course for people in furniture restoration where there'd be lots of jobs. And I tried setting something up, and we met massive opposition from the council, partly linked to a whole issue around homosexuality and the church. So that idea got killed, and I thought, right, but I didn't want to let the idea go of doing something with unemployment. So I thought, first of all, we needed to do it into church because we'd be less vulnerable to political interference. And probably it needed to be something that wouldn't cost much to set up, because furniture restoration required equipment. So I thought, well, maybe we could just help people, teach them how to do interview practice. Now, and I have no idea why I thought I could teach anyone to do this, as I'd only ever been through one interview myself. I just absolutely thought I knew how to do it, which is just appallingly arrogant. Anyway, I did. I started talking to a few. Well, first time Icthus said, yes, fine, go ahead. And then I talked to a few other of Peckham churches and said, can we do it? And I was very much wanting to focus on Peckham, partly because Icthus had a church plant in Peckham, and I got on very well with them leader of that. And partly because it seemed to me North Peckham was the worst place, and we needed to do something there. No, actually, I originally thought that maybe we'd be able to find people in churches who are unemployed. And actually, as I started asking around, I realized that even though everyone said unemployment was a terrible problem, in reality, there were very few unemployed people in churches. And the people who were unemployed had massive other problems, sort of mental health, things like that. And actually, there weren't that many unemployed people. So I ran one course, and it was funded by the Evangelical Alliance. A guy called Michael Hastings, who's now Lord Hastings, actually was then working for the EA, and he had a pot of money, and he gave me the first bit of money to get going. And that first course was almost a complete flop. Hardly anyone came, and yeah, it just didn't work very well. I'll come on to, I was also at the same time setting up the launderette, but I'll come back to that. And then I got pushed for some reason, I can't remember, maybe it was the Evangelical Alliance, but somebody arranged for me to meet an advisor at 10 Downing Street to tell them all about our course. And I wasn't running one. So I had to get it off the ground quickly to say I was doing something for Downing Street. So I then found I recruited a couple of people from the churches and just set up this course and said, this is what we're going to do. And we decided we were going to try and find people by knocking on doors in Peckham. And partly the door knocking came because that Icthus did an awful lot of door-to-door evangelism. So it seemed a sort of obvious thing to do. So we banged on some doors, found a few unemployed people, said there's a course starting next week. Amazingly, some people turned up and we ran a course. And I think probably some people got jobs out of it. And we thought, oh, this is working. And it started from there. So, yeah, I mean, it was very sort of happenstance, and we sort of tried something and it didn't work, and we tried something else and it didn't work. But fairly rapidly, the basic idea of a 4-week course on how to find work, it emerged, and that we would recruit people by door knocking. And this was very much Tory government. Not very, my opinion was they just weren't very interested in the unemployed. So there was, when Labour came in a bit later on, they were incredibly interfering. But under the Tories, people just sort of left to get on with it. So we were able to recruit people, get them to come on courses, and people started getting jobs. Not as many as I hoped, but it seemed to begin to make an impact.
Well, it obviously started to grow because you had to then recruit other people, didn't you? Volunteers
yes.
to help, and then some other staff. So how did it grow?
Well, we started, as we started doing the door knocking, the sort of shape began to emerge. We'd have a couple of people doing two days a week door knocking for a course, and we'd have 2 people training and the creche worker. And we were running these courses about once every 5 or 6 weeks. And we were getting lots and lots of people. So we thought, well, let's set up a second course and we could find more people. So we did that. And then fairly rapidly thought what would be really nice would be to have some stuff for people once they've done the course to help them look for work, a bit like a job club. And then, in fact, then there was a government contract to run a job club. And we then, as a board of, so the board of PECAN, then I remember this vividly, having to make this decision, do we go for government funding or not? And this got all my Anabaptists.
I was going to ask, yeah.
Nerves, because I'd not wanted to go for it. And we debated, in the end decided to go for the funding. And we got the contract and then started running that, and then it sort of just kept on growing. And then as we door knocked, we found other people with other needs. So mental illness, literacy, lots of refugees. And so then started setting up other projects for them. And because we were door knocking, fairly rapidly, we were door knocking 10,000 doors a year. We were really penetrating into the estates and meeting lots of people. And so we had this very good idea about what was needed in the estates, what to do about it.
Yeah, you must have done. I've got in my notes here, redolent of Octavia Hill in the 19th century, who repeatedly went to tenants in arrears to try and assist them. And it seems that she ended up breaking, social isolation was an issue, just the one-to-one contact with people. I'm just trying to imagine 10,000. I mean, that the volume of personal contact that's astonishing.
Yes. I mean, it is. I mean, it just got. I mean, one thing I kept on saying to the recruiters, though, was we'll be back again in 6 months' time. So if someone's not interested, don't try and persuade them. Just there's plenty more people. I mean, so it was a real. We were doing volume, and if you did enough people, we could always find 20 or 30 people who wanted to come, and it was quite a. I think, looking back, quite a big administrative task. This is where my databases came in useful. So I actually did end up writing databases for PECAN as well.
Yeah, but
and
so it's not just the volume of. I'm imagining, Simon, the awareness of PECAN must have been very high, and you've already intimated that your sense of what the needs were locally. So it wasn't just that out of 10,000, approaches, you got 20 people on a course. There's a lot more going on around that, isn't there?
Probably. I mean, the thing is, Jason, I think in an area like Peckham, huge turnover, actually. People were moving all the time. People had complex lives. Actually, I'm not sure we did make that. I think we made a big impact, but I don't think we actually penetrated people's consciousness very much. We were, even if they came on our course, we were a 4-week bit, and hopefully they then got a job, and then it'd be the job that moved them on. I wouldn't want to exaggerate this. I know we made a difference because I did some sort of statistics on it. Unemployment in Peckham actually became lower than that in Dulwich, and I'm pretty confident it was because of what we were doing. So we were making this difference, but I wouldn't say we weren't trying to transform people. We were trying to help them get jobs, and we were good at that.
Brilliant. Great focus. So you've already mentioned, let's come back to flirting with the family business model.
Yeah, I think
what happened there?
You're probably right to call it. Well, I don't know, flirting. It was a bit of a nightmare. So exactly the same time as I was setting up PECAN, I also was setting up a launderette, and the idea was that the launderette was going to generate profit that was going to fund the charity. And this was, in a sense, I think it probably, again, was the sort of slight Anabaptist desire to be independent of government funding and being able to do our own thing. And I thought I knew how to do launderettes. I mean, why I think, my dad was really skeptical about this, but he was incredibly supportive. So he actually gave me some dryers, some big industrial dryers. He came on, I took him round the Gloucester Grove, which was a really scary place. And at the end, he said, this is a really bad place to set up a launderette. And he was right, naturally. So I set up this launderette. There was going to be a cafe as well, there was, in the centre of the Gloucester Grove. And I knew that there were people used to walk half a mile, 3/4 a mile, carrying huge bin liners of dirty laundry to the nearest launderette. So there was a demand, probably not as big a demand. I did do some proper market research. I'd gone around door knocking to ask people, do you have a washing machine? and I knew that the finances only just about worked. And I think I conned it was wishful thinking, and that was quite a salutary lesson. We call it confirmation bias now. That I got the results I was looking for, not what really needed to be. So that was probably a valuable lesson. Anyway, we set up this. It was a lovely laundrette, we had such problems. I used to have to, after work with PECAN, I'd go to the laundrette and I'd hoover out all the dryers and I'd mop the floor. So that would be, and so I wouldn't get home until about 8 o'clock. And there'd be this gang of boys, sort of gang in slightly old-fashioned sense. But they were all enormous. I'm 5'8", and they were all over 6 foot. And they'd come into the laundrette about 7 o'clock, and they'd sort of surround me and say, "We'd like some coffee or some sweets or something," and I'd have to tell them go away. I knew them, so I didn't exactly feel scared by them, but they were definitely trying to intimidate me. And then one day I came into the laundrette and a kid, I assume it was a kid, had destroyed our grills with a car jack and taken just a few seconds to rip the grills to pieces. It was so difficult. So I must admit, all my respect went to Dad, trying to actually making laundrettes pay. So I ended up losing money instead of making money, and we had to close the laundrette. Oh, and I also actually got conned by the council. They charged us a discounted rent, which was great, and then slapped on a massive service charge. But that was also my naivety as well. So,
yeah. Sorry to make you relive it.
Well, I mean, part of this story is learning from mistakes, and some of the laundrette. I had a member of staff who said, and I've always felt this, that PECAN was built on a whole bunch of failure. So the story of PECAN sounds like success, but it wasn't, because it's a laundrette there causing so much problems, so many difficulties. And then we had real problems. Like the second course we ran, a man pulled a gun out on one of my trainers, and we completely mishandled it, just appalling. And so there were really difficult issues as well. So, and I think my feeling isn't success from success from success. It was actually failure after failure and learning from these and incrementally trying to get things a bit better.
Gosh, wow. Gosh, so much there. If we dwell there, I've got too many other questions to ask you. I want to ask you about some of I'll use the word innovative practices and policies that you had at PECAN. As you look back to what you built into the life of the organisation with practices and policies and employment things, are there some particular things that you recall? I know it's at a distance now, but
yeah, I mean, the thing that really made the difference was the equal pay. Everyone was paid the same. And linked to that was I took a very strong view on everyone had to be a Christian. And so I used to tell people when they joined that if they stopped being a Christian, I would sack them. And because I felt if you're going to, partly because of the equal opportunities type legislation, the only way of really being able to say we only will employ Christians was if it was an absolute essential part of the job. And to argue it was an essential part of the job meant that you'd have to implement if someone stopped being a Christian. And it was, so we had a weekly prayer meeting for all the staff. But I think the biggest part of this was equal pay. And this is what I was talking about, but I thought equal pay was sort of my idea until I discovered it in the Upside Down Kingdom. Though it was sort of written more as amusing, shouldn't Christian organisations have an equal pay policy? And clearly I'd been very influenced by this and forgotten it. But to my mind, I find it very hard think how you could justify anything but equal pay. So I now work for a non-Christian organisation. We don't have equal pay, but if you really believe God's given us all gifts, why should one person be paid more for gifts they've been given by God than another person?
So is this a particular Mennonite value overall, or was it just...
No, I don't think so.
You don't think...
I just don't understand why more people don't do it. And it made managing the organisation very much easier, because it meant people were quite keen to be promoted, but promotion just meant you took more responsibility for the same money. And it also meant I could shift people around, so I could more easily. So I could shift, if I felt someone wasn't coping with the job they were in, I could shift them into another job, and there was no pay implications. It made our pay, I don't believe in low pay, just because of equal pay. So our payroll was quite high. We weren't a particularly cheap organisation. So we always struggled over money. But to my mind, it was the most powerful symbol of our Christian faith, really. People really non-Christians really got that this said something. And it made people really uncomfortable. I made Christians I can remember quite a well-known Christian leader sort of standing up and preaching against it. And people really didn't like it, except the staff mostly really loved it. Or at least the people who were on better pay than they would have been otherwise. Managers sometimes began to get irritated. And I did say to people, if you don't like it, you better go. If you don't feel it's right for you, and that's fine. But it also meant that we tended to very strongly look to promote people internally, rather than, because people who would be coming in sort of more senior positions would be having to take a pay cut, which is always very difficult. And I suppose it was also coming a bit out of the sort of the stuff I'd done with Donald Kraybill about sociology around issues of power. I really wanted to divorce, take away some of the symbols of power that went with a hierarchy. So I wasn't trying to get rid of the hierarchy, but I was trying to get rid of, I suppose, symbols of people, particularly pay as a symbol of people being more valuable. So I wanted to be saying everybody's valuable, that we genuinely are a team working together. And it worked brilliantly.
Great. And then what was the reception to that from the clients and local authority and other people?
Clients, well, they didn't mainly know about it. Local authority, I think it did make us much more robust over accusations about being Christian. Because if I said I only employ Christians, everyone would go, oh, how shocking. But if I said it's equal pay, everyone's paid the same, and it's an expression of our faith, sort of people could get that. It made it seem more reasonable. There was a high demand that people lived by a particular lifestyle, a particular set of values. So that, I think, really, it worked together. Each sort of policy supplemented the other.
Yeah. And any drawbacks?
Well, when I left, it made it very hard to recruit my successor. There's obviously a drawback for people who would have been better paid. They have less money. I did it for 14 years, and then I moved on and got a better paid job, and it was nice to get more money. But there was a real loss. I still miss what equal pay did. I think it was a real spiritual battle as well. I think there's such a spiritual power in money, and I think we hide the fact so often that actually we want money. And I think it was one of the real impacts of PECAN. So that, to my mind, that's one of the things I'm proudest of, actually.
Wonderful. Thank you for opening that up for us. We interviewed Steve Chalk recently, and he talked in the interview about the initial suspicion by Southwark Council to what he was trying to do, but then how that changed over time. Did anything similar happen with you? Sort of mentioned a little bit about some of the
Oh, very, very, very much. I mean, so Southwark hated the church when we started. That's my impression. And yet we had real difficulties to start with. I mean, to such an extent that there was a thing called North Peckham Task Force, which was a pot of money that came out of Michael Heseltine after the North Peckham riots. And the leader of that wanted to give us some money. And he met such opposition from the council, he had a nervous breakdown. So there was really, really violent opposition. And then it dramatically changed. Maybe I could tell you another story about this, because I think, again, the impact of PECAN, I was saying on a sort of individual level, I don't think we've impacted people's consciousness very much on the estate. But one of the things we did was I felt, probably after about 2 years, a real sense that we should pray about the housing estates. I think to some extent echoing that sort of vision I'd had from a few years earlier. And I was very influenced by Isaiah 58, you'll be called restorer of streets for dwellings. And I know it's nothing to do with housing estates, but I really felt God was saying we should be looking to see the streets restored. And we should pray against the housing estates, and we should pray that they'd come down. And this was a hard left council with the Tory government, and there was no possibility of it. And what was extraordinary was about 3-4 months after we started praying, the council was given 26 million, in a thing called a single regeneration budget. And then the chair of the single regeneration budget was a Christian, and other people who were Christians started getting into various places in Peckham, the head of the police, the head of the big secondary school, several councillors. And suddenly it was like the whole place began to change. It became much easier being a Christian organisation. And I felt God was really doing something. And the housing estates started getting demolished and being rebuilt. Sadly, they didn't get rid of all they did restore some of the streets, but not all the streets. But it was absolutely transformational, and Peckham really began to change. And then Damilola Taylor was killed, and that was so appalling. It was such a sort of, I mean, it was appalling, obviously, for this little boy, but it was appalling in what it did to the whole sense that Peckham was going somewhere. I remember the real feeling of despair of that. So I mean, I felt God was really doing something in Peckham, really overturning the spiritual powers that had sort of gripped it, and that it was people who'd been placed in all sorts of positions within Peckham sort of really brought about that transformation. It was a real Christian ministry there.
Gosh, amazing. Gosh, I mean, there's so much there. We could talk for hours. Gosh, yes, I've forgotten about Damilola Taylor. Turbulent times. So, Simon, I mean, all that time you were at PECAN, a pioneering organisation, your value for the employees. You had an Investors in People award, which must have been one of the first awards. Was it one of the first?
Yeah, please. I mean, I suppose one other aspect that we haven't touched on much was I was also interested in management. I suppose I'd felt I'd actually been praying from before I'd gone to America that God would give me an opportunity to sort of be in a management position. and I'd read, do you remember In Search of Excellence?
Yes, I do.
So I'd read that, and I'd been to this Vineyard conference on management, and so I was interested in management and trying to do management. So it had been, for me, PECAN was also this opportunity to try and really create something or an organisation as I felt an organisation should be run. Again, why I felt I hadn't got much experience, but anyway. So.
But so with all of that, so the first Investors in People Award, and you've lowered unemployment in Peckham, and you receive an OBE.
That was when I left. Pretty much when I left PECAN, yes.
Was it when you left, or was it just before, or were you on the way out, leaving?
I think it was after I think I'd left by the time I got it. I was nominated by my staff, which was lovely of them, and I didn't actually know I'd been nominated. Yeah, so that was fantastic.
I think it's wonderful how they work. You can't nominate yourself; other people nominate you.
Yeah, I know that. It was such a treat.
Yeah. So with all of that and all of that success, but with all the failure behind it that you've told us about, what caused you to move on, if I can ask? You got this record. Why did you decide it was time to?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is I think founders are a menace. And sadly, everything I've seen about it that's true. And I didn't want to destroy the thing I'd created. People used to say to me, "Is this your sort of life calling?" And I was thinking, no, I definitely shouldn't be. And I think people who found things have too great a sense of ownership. I'd seen it gone very badly wrong with Icthus. That was awful. But I've seen it in lots of other, not just Christian organizations, but Christian organizations, I think, are particularly vulnerable to this because of people's sense that God has been using them. So I'd done 14 years. I thought I need to move on. I was also becoming interested in issues around criminal justice and around fathering. And I could have used PECAN to create some new projects. But that wasn't really what PECAN was about. So that probably would have then been using the organization for my own purposes. So I felt I should move.
Great. Thank you. So, and then if we can put some modesty aside, you're a wonderfully modest man. What values or qualities do you think you communicated best at PECAN? The DNA. As founders are a menace, but that's assuming the less menacing part of you established something good there. What do you think continued after you left?
I think I think people felt valued. Again, and that comes down to equal pay. That literally people felt valued. So the sense that we were making an impact. I've always wanted also to be able to be quite rigorous in being able to say, are we really making an impact? Not to make claims. I think Christians often are a bit too fluffy in the claims they make. So I was very concerned about doing good monitoring, good evaluation. I really wanted an organization where people would be able to, when they finished with the organization, staff, they would say, okay, I'm moving on, but I've got something good out of it. And which is why we did Investors in People, because I wanted people to know we were going to invest in them. And that I didn't want people to be trapped in a sort of Christian ministry. It becomes too absorbing, I think, a lot of times, Christian ministry, the sense that you're doing this work of such great significance. And it often becomes the pastor or the leader, you become a tool to forward their own ministry rather than each individual having a ministry of their own. So that's what I wanted people to get out of it, that they were autonomous people responsible for themselves, that they developed well in PECAN, and then they moved on.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, I'm looking at the website. I was looking at it earlier for PECAN. It looks like it's continued to grow and develop with new initiatives. And
it's had its ups and downs. I think it was very tricky for a while, but I think Chris Price is running it now. It's doing a great job.
I can still see some of this DNA and the activities from you. I say the less menacing parts of you, Simon, as a founder that you said. So thank you. So some of your more recent leadership roles have been in organisations dealing with perhaps the most intractable of all social problems, crime and incarceration of prisoners. You've already sort of nudged a little bit into telling us about your interest growing in that area. Can you tell us a bit more now about that growing interest and how you moved into it?
Well, I think that there was always a bit of an interest there. When I was setting up Launderette, just as we're about opening it, this elderly black woman came up, and she'd just been mugged. And she was incredibly upset, not surprisingly. And I suddenly realized that crime is this obviously, it's thick of me, I should realize it, but crime is a real social justice issue. That the people who suffer crime the most are the poor and the most vulnerable in society. And so crime isn't just bad, it is utterly destructive to the roots of society. So I'm very interested in particularly what stops crime, and I've been particularly interested in how do people move away from a criminal lifestyle. Technically, it's called desistance, and the biggest factor, well, I think the biggest factor is actually their personal relationships, their family relationships. And this is hugely undervalued by the whole judicial criminal justice system. And so I think there's a real need to be trying to strengthen family relationships to help people move away from crime. And so I've been involved in doing some of that. And of course, it's not very easy.
Yeah, I bet. So you move on from PECAN 2002.
Yeah.
And then in 2003, you become the CEO of Stepping Stones. Is that right?
Yeah, so Stepping Stones was providing accommodation for people who came out of prison. And what I've learned from that, most of all, is people who come out of prison and they lose their relationships, they lose their homes. And if you've lost your home and you go into a hostel, nearly always they go back into crime. We were so unsuccessful. I mean, we provided accommodation for people, but people went back into crime. And so that was one of the real learning things. How if they lost, if the wife said, "I don't want to see you again," they were out on the streets. And men in prison are incredibly worried about that. They're incredibly worried about their relationships. So I did that for 4 years, and we started developing work to do work in the prisons on preparing people for release. I mean, this was a little bit ahead of its time because now it's terribly fashionable to do what's called through the gate work. But we were trying to do it 10 years ago. Nearly 20 years ago. And it's definitely the right way forward. It's quite hard to make it work in practice. Try and do that. And then after I did that for 4 years, and then from Stepping Stones, I moved into Time for Families, which is about doing relationship education in prisons, which was absolutely brilliant. I love doing that. So we were running courses, parenting courses and relationship courses in the prisons, and we were bringing the partners into the prison, which created huge security problems for the prisons. They got terribly worried about it. And we did that for 4 years. And that was really exciting. But the government introduced, massively changed the way prison funding happened. And I felt we would have to merge with another charity, which was really sad. I don't know if that was the right decision or not, but anyway, that was a real pity. And I then had to go find another job. So I was the redundant CEO.
So is that how you ended up then becoming the CEO of the Society of Analytical Psychotherapy? I remember seeing that on your CV. I'm like, I know I haven't spoken to you for many years. Everything's made sense until then. I'm like, okay, that's
I agree. That didn't make huge sense. It was a bit, I needed a job. I learned a lot from it. And in many ways, it was remarkably like a church. So I did that for, as sort of part-time for a while. And then I also got involved in doing work in Bosnia on an anti-jihadist program. And that was really interesting. So,
yeah. And you were doing, did you start a master's as you moved to the Society of Analytical?
Yes, I was doing I did a master's in criminology.
Criminology. Tell me about your master's. What was that like as a learning experience? What did you learn?
The criminology one. Well, I specialised in about understanding desistance, and I mean the academic criminology. There's a real battle between psychological explanations for crime and sociological explanations. On the whole, the psychological have won. So most sort of lay people believe crime must be something to do with poverty, and it's almost not. It's all to do with peer relations, peers, your social group, and how you interpret opportunities. It's all about your psychology. And this is pretty, I'll probably have there'll probably be a whole bunch of criminologists who will say, he's talking rubbish. But I think the evidence is pretty clear cut that it's psychological. And again, that's partly why I think issues around family relationships are just so important.
Yeah. I can imagine. So it was, sorry, I don't want to stray too much into research methods with what you were doing, but those different where are things at now in that world between the psychological and the sociological? How are things working out?
What's interesting, which most people have missed out on, is that pretty much over the last 15 years, crime has reduced enormously. And that's mainly because of target hardening. And that's, better alarms, better double glazing, all those sorts of things. And that's partly it's made it hard to commit crimes because actually people make rational decisions to a large extent about whether they're going to make a crime. Will it pay? Are they likely to get caught? So I think the psychology side has become stronger, other than in the last few years, violent crimes increased because of gangs issues. So that maybe counts as what I've said. But other than that, it's pretty clear cut.
Oh, well, thank you for letting me pick your brains on that, Simon. Fascinating. Actually, let me ask you, at PECAN, some of the practices you had there, were there ones that you found didn't transfer? I'll ask the question that way. Didn't transfer to working in the prison support sector? I can see you go from being a CEO to being a CEO, but did you think, oh gosh, what worked there doesn't work over here?
There are things I really miss. There's a huge difference between running a Christian and non-Christian organisation. I'm Time for Families was a Christian organisation, but then obviously the SAP, Society of Analytical Psychology, wasn't, and my current job only connected to. And I miss the sense of a common purpose and a common language that draws people together. And the assumptions you can make, which maybe not completely true, but I miss that side of it. I also miss the feeling that being a founder it makes it different for you and means people relate to you a bit differently as well. And I miss the sense of that you almost that people trust you more, I think. I think they know that you've got a bigger stake in it in some ways. And, you know, so when people can, it's a job and people can move on. I mean, and I always wanted PECAN to be a job for people. I didn't want them to be sucked into something more than that. But I slightly miss still the different relationship I have with people because I've just come in as the chief exec and, you know, I could go again.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for letting me draw that out from you. Now, Simon, at a recent conference, you were reported as saying that prison destroys relationships, and yet we know that relationships are the key to desistance.
Yes.
You've already talked about this a little bit, but can you just explain a bit more about, I mean, you might want to touch on the psychoanalytical nature of it, but why is it relationships? It might seem blindingly obvious, but why do they deter prisoners from reoffending? It was just talking
okay.
a little bit more.
I mean, well, the first thing is crime is male. 90% of all crime is committed by men, and it's mainly by young men 18 to 25. So in itself, that is the key factor around criminality. What gets a young man to stop spending time with antisocial peers, change their attitudes to risk, give themselves a longer term sense of the future? Well, it's primarily where they feel committed enough to a woman and to a relationship that when she says stop spending time with these, he listens to her. When she says, I want you to go to work and earn some honest money, he listens to her. I mean, I don't want to say it, but it's almost blindingly obvious, isn't it? I mean, we all know that's what men are like. And I know it's cliched, but the cliches are largely true. And so what we're doing with desistance, most men stop committing crime in their late 20s. There's a huge move away from crime in the late 20s. And I think that's primarily because they grow up. They get involved in a relationship, they settle down, they have children, they get a job. Just what we'd expect. What we're trying to do is get this to happen a bit earlier, because that's an awful lot fewer crimes committed.
Yeah. Gosh, fascinating. Gosh.
It's not rocket science.
It sounds quite, yeah, great.
And prison destroying relationships is obvious in many ways. You're inside. I mean, one of the issues, an argument against what I'm saying, is that the guys have committed crimes having been in a relationship. So what I'm also after is trying to strengthen the relationship so that the man values it more and is more prepared to change to fit in with what will please the woman.
Yeah, got it. Now, change of pace on these last few questions, Simon. If you ruled the world and every day was the first day of spring, what specific innovations would you introduce into the way society views and treats prisoners and ex-prisoners? Experiment, in other words. Or if you could wave a magic wand and society just changed how it views prisoners.
We are far too punitive. I feed it to myself. There is the whole sense of prison works is just, I mean, what prison does is punish, and it works very well as a punishment, but it doesn't deter. Again, there's all the research overwhelmingly is the sense of being caught is what deters people. So I would probably shorten prison sentences. I'd want prisons to work so that people had a bit more responsibility. I would be looking to try and integrate families a bit more. I'd be trying to make sure prisoners were in prisons a bit nearer to home. I think that would make a difference. I mean, we we just have a very ineffective criminal justice system in terms of rehabilitating people.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Simon, although reducing poverty and reducing reoffending might seem very different things, it does sound like they're greatly related to one another. So beyond the relational, there is some sociological, there must be some sociological dynamics to this as well. Have you ever spent any time, done theological reflection in the past, and you've got all these degrees now, have you looked at the relationship between isolation, deprivation? Have you looked at that together, Simon? These two worlds of, you've mentioned the relational, social, the psychological, and then the sociological, that demographic of, of poverty and stuff. But what's the relationship between them? Because they're not completely separate, are they?
No, for me, it's a sense of hope, sense of where you go with your life. So I see employment. Do you remember I said right at the start, the thing that first got me into employment was this Christian book saying we will have to learn to live in a. I absolutely reject that. I still absolutely reject it, even with COVID and recessions. I absolutely reject it. I think it's a despicable philosophy. And I don't like people being put on the shelf, being told that they have no role to play. And I think that's the same with criminal justice. I hate the way with criminal justice, criminality is sort of transmitted in families. If your father or eldest brother are in prison, you have a very high chance of going to prison yourself. I want to see this sense of being both hopeless and also marginalized in society turned around. I don't see them as very different. Maybe it's just in my own emotional impact. It does the same sort of thing to me emotionally, thinking about both of them.
Well, if we get back to the fervour of your faith, at this point, I can sense that your heart and your passion around this. What does it mean for you to be a Christian in that place and that space? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I imagine you're being incarnational and present in some way. But how would you describe yourself? And what does your other than a passion for this? Where is your faith manifest in these situations?
I think, Jason, it's always a tension between the sort of technical side, which can easily become faithless. I think C.S. Lewis talked about this, practical men being people who didn't have faith because they practiced. And I find that how can you be really good at what you do and yet with faith? I do genuinely think these are spiritual issues we're addressing. I think unemployment, in what it does to people, is spiritually damaging, and I think obviously crime even more so. So for me, trying to be a channel for God to touch people is what I suppose I think I'm about, and I want to do it. I like doing it in an organisation, not just as an individual.
Brilliant, wonderful. So, last couple of questions, Simon. Looking back at a youthful and idealistic Simon Pellew, what
you got the name right?
A few, thankfully. What beliefs has experience led you to, I was going to say, at least ameliorate or maybe move on from? And conversely, what are you most grateful that you've held on to and you've developed? If we could get you and a younger you in a room and you were saying, that didn't work and I've let that go, but this one, that's the best idea you ever had.
I do wonder whether the whole issue of government money. I said right at the start. A couple of months ago, I went to see the George Muller Museum in Bristol, and George Muller. I'd heard this story about George Muller. He set up orphanages in the 1870s, and I thought he had this sort of little orphanage, and he prayed, and people brought him food. This isn't a little orphanage. These are vast buildings. He had 2,000 orphans.
Oh, did he? I always assumed they were only a couple of hundred kids or something.
No, it's 2,000, and that's 5 enormous buildings. And he had, over the time, he had 10,000, I think, orphans. And he must have faced everything. He must have faced difficult staff, child abuse. He interviewed he got all the boys to go into apprenticeships, and he interviewed every person. And he did all this without government money. And I do wonder whether whether I should have gone for something harder and more dramatic. I don't know. I mean, I must admit, getting government money is always quite nice, but it does come with such strings. And I still struggle with that one now. I think I'd probably be, so I think all the challenges for myself have been, have I kept the spiritual dimension there enough? I think the other things I've probably done is I've always hated the people who've bigged up their work. But I probably should have done a bit more of that. I think probably there was more of a story to tell than I was comfortable about saying it. So those are the things I do differently. Things I hold on to. I think about treating people, trying to treat people well. I feel, I've just even talking to you now, I still completely believe what I was trying to do with PECAN and with staff and trying to make it work the way I wanted it to work. I think I got that pretty much right.
Great. I can see the passion. I can see the enthusiasm. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So my last question, how did we get to a last question? Gosh, I told you time whizzes by.
It has, yes.
So fascinating. It's been a real privilege listening to you, Simon. Talking about the story that you maybe could have told a little more and made more of. Part of preparing for the interview today is and Simon Machin, our researcher, we see that through your career, there is a story about the organizations that you've run that have been greatly admired in the Christian community. So if you were able to, out of everything you've achieved, maybe things that you've already told me, or alongside it, what gives you the greatest satisfaction as you look back so far on all that you've done and all these organizations?
I think it's surprising. It's actually the staff, not the impact. I'm proud that I've seen people move on and achieve what I wanted them to achieve or develop. So that's the stuff that and again, in some extent, being the chief exec, you don't have a lot to do with the clients. I did interview practice with people and stuff like that. So that which is great, and I'm pleased about the impact. But it's seeing the staff develop, giving people good jobs, is what I'm proud of. And even though it was difficult, I think I'm quite proud that I walked away from PECAN. I think that's a lesson that Christian leaders often don't seem to learn.
Would have been easy to stay, I presume.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, maybe my trustees would have told me it would be time to go.
I'm going to sneak one more question in. What's in the future for you, Simon?
Oh,
Far ahead do
I'm
you
not
look?
sure.
Set on.
Oh, we're all getting on a bit now. So I think, my current job with Only Connect, I want to get back to doing relationship work. And I think with Only Connect that we want to go in that direction. So that's, I think, for the next few years. Beyond that, I'm not quite sure. So anyway, the next 2 or 3 years, I think, trying to get into doing some relationship work in prisons. Well, in fact, because I'm currently doing unemployment, and actually linking unemployment and relationships is definitely the best thing of all. We should bring everything neatly together.
Oh, I can again see your passion and excitement there. So Simon, on a personal note, I didn't mention it at the start, but here, I met you probably, it would have been about 20 years ago. You were at PECAN, and a baby church plant, and I was much younger with hair. And we're engaging in a community project with the local authority and needed some orientation and advice. And I remember your generosity of time, the advice that you gave that I still carry with me. And a bit like you, I've swapped some more stories with you. It was a bruising time. We learnt as much from the failures that we did, but I'm here 20 years later, and we have some amazing projects in our community where we partner and do things. And you were an inspiration, and your advice, I still carry some of your little tips around me, which I said were mostly predictions about things that would go wrong. And I can see now the depth of how much you learned from those failures. But thank you for persisting. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your humility. It's also been lovely to tease out and see that Mennonite tapestry, which I remember vividly from 20 years ago, and to see you now 20 years on and what that's led to and what you've done. And thank you for who you are. And
thanks, Jason.
And it really has been a great honour and a privilege to do this interview with you today, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.